In the restless years that followed independence, the promise of the American Revolution hung in the balance. 13 former colonies, newly free from British rule, found themselves bound by little more than a fragile agreement, a government of states more than a people, marked by uncertainty and discord. Across the fledgling nation, commerce faltered, debts mounted, and states quarreled over boundaries and trade. The Articles of Confederation, once a symbol of unity, revealed itself as an inadequate shield against chaos. Delegates and citizens alike questioned whether liberty could survive without order, and whether union could endure without strength. In town halls and taverns, in fields and city streets, the question echoed, what kind of nation would America become? The road from revolution to constitution was neither straight nor certain, but it was here, in these early struggles, that the blueprint for a new government began to take shape. The guns fell silent in 1783, and with the Treaty of Paris, the United States emerged as an independent nation. Yet, as the smoke of revolution cleared, the true challenge began: how to govern a country founded on liberty but adrift in uncertainty. The 13 states, united by shared ideals and the hardship of war, now faced the daunting task of creating a system strong enough to hold them together, yet restrained enough to preserve the freedoms they had fought so hard to win. The solution, at least at first, was the Articles of Confederation, a document historians widely regard as a well-intentioned but ultimately flawed first attempt at nationhood. Drafted in the crucible of war and adopted by the Continental Congress in 1777, the Articles of Confederation became the United States' first constitution when they took effect in 1781. The vision was clear: to create a league of friendship among sovereign and independent states, each fiercely protective of its autonomy. Under this arrangement, Congress was a body with limited authority. It could request funds, make recommendations, and conduct diplomacy, but it lacked the power to tax, regulate commerce, or compel states to obey its decisions. Each state had an equal voice, one vote in Congress, regardless of population or size. Any attempt to amend the Articles required the unanimous consent of all 13 states, a standard so high that meaningful change soon proved impossible. The founders' caution was understandable. Having fought a war against centralized tyranny, they were wary of replacing one overbearing authority with another. The Second Continental Congress sought a government just strong enough to secure independence, but not so powerful as to threaten hard-won liberties. In practice, though, the Articles created a central government so weak it could barely function. There was no executive to enforce laws, no judiciary to resolve disputes, and no effective means for Congress to assert its will. Almost immediately, the new nation began to strain under the weight of its own design. The end of the war brought not just freedom, but a cascade of economic and political problems. The United States was deeply in debt, with obligations to soldiers, foreign creditors, and merchants left unpaid. The war had upended trade, stripped the country of its primary markets, and left the economy in shambles. Between 1771 and 1791, the United States lost more than half its trade with England, deepening the crisis. Inflation soared, and the lack of a stable, unified currency complicated commerce across state lines. Each state, jealously guarding its sovereignty, issued its own money, creating a patchwork of currencies that made even simple transactions difficult. Congress, lacking the power to tax, could only request funds from the states. Too often, those requests went unanswered. States, struggling with their own debts and economic woes, had little incentive to contribute. As James Madison would later argue, this dependence on voluntary state contributions rendered Congress ineffective and left the nation vulnerable. The inability to collect revenue meant Congress could not pay its debts, support a national army, or even guarantee the basic functions of government. Warnings of bankruptcy and dissolution echoed through the halls of government. Economic distress soon spilled over into political unrest. In the countryside, farmers were crushed by debt and taxes they could not pay. Some states passed debtor relief laws, sparking controversy and instability. The most dramatic expression of this unrest came in 1786 with Shays' Rebellion, when armed farmers in Massachusetts rose up against state authorities. The rebellion, fueled by economic hardship and a sense that government was unresponsive, exposed Congress's inability to maintain order or muster a national response. Without a centralized military or the power to enforce tax collection, the Confederation government stood by, helpless. As the 1780s wore on, the weaknesses of the Articles became ever more apparent. The lack of a unified national policy on trade and commerce meant that states often acted in their own interests, imposing tariffs on one another and pursuing conflicting economic strategies. This fragmentation stifled growth and sowed discord. With no authority to regulate interstate commerce, Congress could do little to resolve these disputes. The state's independence, once a source of pride, now became a source of conflict. Disputes over boundaries, lands, and river navigation flared across the country. By 1787, 10 states were embroiled in serious conflicts with their neighbors. Early attempts at arbitration or negotiation were limited and often proved ineffective. The Articles provided a theoretical mechanism for resolving such disputes, but without an executive or judiciary to enforce decisions, the process faltered. The lack of a strong central authority meant even minor disagreements could fester, undermining unity and cooperation. Foreign policy presented another set of challenges. Congress, lacking respect and support from the states, could not conduct effective diplomacy or defend American interests abroad. Each state was free to pursue its own foreign policies, further weakening the nation's standing. Without the power to raise funds or field a standing army, the United States appeared fractured and vulnerable on the world stage. The economic crisis of the 1780s deepened. The loss of British markets left American merchants scrambling, and the country's inability to raise revenue or unify economic policy hampered recovery. Efforts by Congress to impose import taxes were repeatedly blocked by state resistance, as unanimous consent was required for any amendment to the Articles. The states' reluctance to cede power to the central government created a stalemate, leaving pressing problems unresolved year after year. Inside Congress, the situation was no better. Poor attendance and lack of engagement sapped the body's effectiveness. Without the means to compel participation or enforce its decisions, Congress often found itself unable to act, even in moments of crisis. The sense of national purpose that had fueled the revolution seemed to dissipate in the face of parochial interests and competing state loyalties. The period after the Revolution, sometimes called the not yet United States, was marked by instability, depression, and a pervasive sense that the promise of independence was slipping away. While the Revolution had inspired new state constitutions and broadened political participation, it had also unleashed forces that threatened to pull the country apart. The Articles of Confederation, intended to preserve liberty and guard against tyranny, instead left the new nation weak, divided, and increasingly unable to meet the challenges before it. As the decade drew to a close, calls for change grew louder. Leaders from across the states, many of whom had fought side by side for independence, worried that the fragile Union might not survive. The weaknesses of the Articles, its inability to tax, regulate commerce, resolve disputes, or enforce the law, were no longer theoretical concerns. They were lived realities, evident in empty coffers, economic paralysis, and mounting unrest. The American Revolution had achieved its immediate aim, independence from Britain. But the question of how to bind 13 fiercely independent states into a functioning nation remained unresolved. The creation of the United States Constitution, born out of frustration with the Articles of Confederation and the challenges of the 1780s, would be the answer to this question. But before that bold experiment in government could begin, the flaws and failures of the first Constitution would provide powerful lessons and a stark warning about the dangers of a government too weak to govern. In the spring of 1787, as Philadelphia's streets shed the last chills of winter, delegates from across the young United States converged on the city. Their destination was the imposing Pennsylvania State House, soon to be known as Independence Hall. The air was thick with expectation and uncertainty. The task before them was nothing less than rescuing the American project from faltering. While their official mandate was simply to revise the existing framework of government, those who gathered soon found themselves swept up in a far more ambitious undertaking, one that would redefine the nation itself. 70 men had been chosen by their states to attend, but over the course of that long, sweltering summer, only 55 actually participated in the debates. The group was a tapestry of personalities and backgrounds, ranging in age from energetic youth to venerable elder statesmen. The youngest was just 26, and the oldest, Benjamin Franklin, was 81. The average age hovered around 42, a blend of fresh vision and hard-earned wisdom. Many had served in the Continental Congress or helped craft state constitutions, bringing both experience and a sense of urgency to their work. Yet not all the nation's leading lights were present. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, both serving abroad as diplomats, were absent from the proceedings. Still, the Assembly boasted an extraordinary roster. George Washington, whose presence lent almost mythic gravitas, was unanimously elected President of the Convention. James Madison, meticulous and scholarly, will become known as the Father of the Constitution. George Mason, principled and outspoken, Roger Sherman, shrewd and pragmatic, William Patterson, defender of small state interests, and James Wilson, a keen legal mind, all played pivotal roles. Each brought unique perspectives and deep convictions, setting the stage for months of spirited, sometimes heated, debate. The proceedings themselves were cloaked in secrecy, Guards stood at the doors, and windows were kept shut against both eavesdroppers and the oppressive summer heat. The delegates agreed to keep their discussions confidential, allowing for frank exchanges without fear of public backlash or misinterpretation. The records that survived, meticulously compiled by Madison and supplemented by notes from others like Robert Yates, offer a rare glimpse into the intellectual ferment and clashing ambitions that marked the convention. Almost immediately, it became clear that simply patching up the old system would not suffice. The Articles of Confederation, with their cumbersome mechanisms and lack of central authority, had proven unworkable. The delegates began to contemplate something far bolder, the creation of an entirely new government, one that could harness the strengths of a unified nation while safeguarding the liberties hard-won in the Revolution. Early in the convention, Virginia's delegation advanced a sweeping proposal known as the Virginia Plan. Crafted largely by Madison, this plan called for a strong national government structured with three separate branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, each with distinct powers, echoing the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers such as Montesquieu. Most notably, the plan envisioned a bicameral legislature with representation based on population or financial contribution, a prospect that thrilled large states but alarmed their smaller counterparts. The Virginia Plan quickly became the axis around which subsequent debates revolved. In response, delegates from smaller states, wary of being overwhelmed by their larger neighbors, offered the New Jersey Plan. This alternative proposed a single legislative chamber, with each state enjoying equal representation regardless of size. The debate between these two visions, one favoring proportional representation, the other insisting on equal state sovereignty, threatened to derail the entire convention. Passions ran high, and for a time, the prospect of a permanent impasse loomed. Roger Sherman, a delegate from Connecticut, helped broker the compromise that would ultimately hold the Union together. Known as the Great Compromise, or Connecticut Compromise, this solution merged elements from both plans. The legislature would have two chambers, a House of Representatives with seats apportioned according to population, and a Senate where each state would have an equal voice. This delicate balance appeased both large and small states, though it did not settle all anxieties about the reach of a powerful central government. Beneath the surface, another divisive issue simmered: slavery. The convention was deeply split on how to count enslaved people for purposes of representation and taxation. Southern states, with large enslaved populations, wanted them fully counted to boost their influence in the House of Representatives, while northern states objected, arguing that states should not benefit politically from a population denied basic rights and freedoms. After intense negotiation, the delegates settled on the 3/5 compromise, under which 3 out of every 5 enslaved persons would be counted toward each state's population total. This arrangement gave the southern states greater weight in Congress than their free populations alone would have allowed, but it also exposed the deep moral and political fissures that would haunt the nation for generations. The debate over slavery did not end there. Another flashpoint arose over the future of the transatlantic slave trade. Some delegates pressed for its immediate abolition, while others insisted on its continuation, citing economic necessity. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Congress would be barred from prohibiting the importation of enslaved people before 1808, a concession that allowed the Constitution to move forward, but left a profound stain on the nation's founding document. Throughout these debates, the delegates wrestled not only with practical concerns, but with fundamental questions about the nature of government and human liberty. The intellectual foundations of their work ran deep, drawing on classical authors like Aristotle and Cicero, as well as Enlightenment philosophers such as John Locke and Montesquieu. Locke's writings on natural rights and the social contract, and Montesquieu's advocacy for the separation of powers, were frequently invoked as the framers sought to design a system that would prevent tyranny without lapsing into chaos. The resulting blueprint established a federal system with 3 distinct branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, each designed to check and balance the others. Power was distributed between the national government and the states, and mechanisms were built in to allow for future amendments. The delegates understood that no system could be perfect or permanent, but they hoped to create a structure sturdy enough to endure the unpredictable tests of history. As the final days of summer approached, exhaustion set in. Not all were satisfied with the outcome. George Mason, for example, refused to sign, troubled by the absence of a Bill of Rights. In the end, 39 delegates affixed their names to the document on September 17, 1787, a moment that would echo through American history. The Constitution, complete with its compromises and innovations, marked a revolution in the art of government. It drew upon the ideals of the Declaration of Independence while forging new answers to the perennial problems of power, representation, and liberty. The work of the convention was not the end, but rather the beginning of a new national debate. The document they produced would soon face the scrutiny of the states, and the skepticism of those who worried it gave too much power to the center. Yet the framework established in that closed, sweltering chamber has endured, its principles influencing not only the United States but the world beyond. The grand experiment in Philadelphia had given the new nation a chance to survive and, ultimately, to thrive. When the last signatures dried on the parchment in Philadelphia, the work of crafting the Constitution was far from finished. In many ways, the greatest test still lay ahead. The new blueprint for American government would remain just ink on paper unless it could secure the trust and approval of the people themselves. The framers, aware of the deep divisions and suspicions lingering in the states, designed a ratification process that bypassed the traditional corridors of power. Rather than putting the fate of the Constitution in the hands of state legislatures, bodies that might feel threatened by a stronger national government, they called for specially elected conventions in each state. This choice was no accident. It was a deliberate appeal to popular sovereignty, a bold assertion that ultimate authority resided with the people, not their usual representatives. The stakes were high. Under Article 7, the Constitution would take effect once 9 states ratified it, a shift from the unanimity required to amend the Articles of Confederation. This new standard underscored both the urgency and the precariousness of the endeavor. The ratification process quickly became a national drama, unfolding in town halls, newspapers, and private parlors. The very future of the United States seemed to hang in the balance as citizens weighed whether to embrace a new order or cling to the familiar constraints of state-centered power. The country split into 2 camps, each convinced it stood as the guardian of liberty. On one side were the Federalists, champions of a robust national government and architects of the new Constitution. They argued that the chaos and weakness of the previous decade, highlighted by episodes like Shays' Rebellion, demanded a government with the power to tax, regulate commerce, and provide for the common defense. The Federalists insisted that the Constitution's careful system of separated powers and checks and balances would prevent tyranny. They presented the document as the logical culmination of lessons learned from state constitution-making and the failures of the Articles. Their adversaries, soon known as the Anti-Federalists, were not a monolithic group but were united in their suspicion of central authority. For them, the Constitution represented a dangerous consolidation of power. Many Anti-Federalists had helped forge the revolution and saw themselves as the true defenders of the people's rights. They argued that the new government would trample on state sovereignty, override local control, and threaten the liberties hard-won in the struggle against Britain. Some even feared that the proposed presidency could become a new monarchy in all but name. The absence of a Bill of Rights, in their view, left citizens exposed to future abuses. Influential voices such as George Mason and Patrick Henry spoke out forcefully, warning of the perils of unchecked national power. The Anti-Federalists favored retaining strong state governments and, in many cases, supported a single-chamber legislature as less prone to the intrigues of elites. The debate played out in public and often passionate terms. Newspapers brimmed with essays, pamphlets, and letters as both sides sought to shape public opinion. The Federalists launched a remarkable campaign of persuasion, the most famous weapon being the Federalist Papers, penned under the pseudonym Publius by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. These essays went far beyond simple advocacy. They explained, in accessible language, the logic behind the Constitution's provisions. The authors addressed not only the need for a stronger government, but also the mechanisms by which liberty would be preserved, the separation of powers, the system of checks and balances, and the careful allocation of authority between the states and the federal government. Their arguments targeted the undecided, seeking to reassure those wary of centralized control without dismissing their fears. The Anti-Federalists responded in kind, often writing under classical pseudonyms like Brutus and Cato. Their essays were widely read and influential, especially in rural areas and smaller states where suspicion of distant authority ran deep. The Anti-Federalists did not merely criticize, they offered their own vision, one that prioritized local democracy and the preservation of rights through explicit guarantees. Their relentless pressure forced the Federalists to confront the Constitution's shortcomings, especially the lack of a Bill of Rights. The ratification process itself became a kind of political theater, with each state staging its own drama. Conventions, rather than legislatures, debated the merits and pitfalls of the Constitution. The Massachusetts model. A convention called specifically for ratification and composed of delegates elected by the people became the standard across the states. These gatherings were often raucous, with passions running high. In some places, the debate spilled out of the meeting halls and into the streets. In Albany, New York, tempers flared so hotly that Federalists and Anti-Federalists resorted to physical brawls, a vivid reminder that the stakes were deeply personal and emotions raw. As the months wore on, the outcome remained uncertain. Federalists worked tirelessly to sway delegates and the public, sometimes offering strategic promises to win over skeptics. The most crucial of these was the pledge to add amendments addressing the rights of individuals, a concession to the Anti-Federalists' most potent argument. This promise would ultimately pave the way for the Bill of Rights, but in the heat of the ratification battle, it was a calculated move to secure enough support. The process unfolded with remarkable speed, though not without suspense. Delaware, the smallest state, acted first, ratifying unanimously on December 7, 1787. Georgia followed quickly, and other states soon debated and voted in turn. Each ratification was a small drama, with close votes and last-minute shifts. The Federalist strategy, combining public persuasion, savvy negotiation, and the promise of future amendments, proved effective but not overwhelming. In several states, the margin for ratification was razor-thin, reflecting how closely divided public opinion truly was. Historians have noted that the result could easily have gone the other way had circumstances shifted just slightly. All eyes turned to the magic number, 9. When New Hampshire ratified on June 21, 1788, the threshold was crossed and the Constitution became the official framework of government, supplanting the Articles of Confederation. Yet the work was not finished. Two of the largest and most influential states, Virginia and New York, had not yet ratified, and their eventual agreement was vital for the legitimacy and practical functioning of the new nation. The debate raged on in these states, with the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers circulating widely, delegates making impassioned speeches, and citizens weighing the future of their country. In the end, the tide turned. One by one, the remaining states joined, some with grudging acceptance, others with celebrations in the streets. Rhode Island, ever wary of ceding power, was the last to ratify, holding out until May 29, 1790. By then, the promise of a Bill of Rights and the reality of a functioning national government had eased many, though not all, concerns. Looking back, the ratification struggle was more than a legal process. It was a crucible in which the meaning of American democracy was tested and, in many ways, defined. The deep divide between Federalists and Anti-Federalists was not simply about the structure of government. It was about the very nature of freedom and the balance between unity and autonomy. The Federalist victory was not complete. The Anti-Federalist legacy would live on in the Bill of Rights, in the continuing tug-of-war between state and federal power, and in the persistent American debate over how best to secure liberty and justice for all. The Constitution emerged not as a perfect document, but as a living framework. Its adoption a testament to the power of political argument, compromise, and the enduring belief that the people themselves must shape their own destiny. As the dust settled from the bruising debates over ratification, a new chapter in American history began, not with fanfare, but with lingering uncertainty. Many citizens, especially those who had doubted the wisdom of a powerful central government, waited to see whether the promises made to secure the Constitution's approval would actually be fulfilled. The new government, for all its structure and checks, still lacked one crucial element: a clear, unmistakable guarantee of individual rights. This omission was no accident. The architects of the Constitution had argued fiercely over whether such a list of rights was necessary. Federalists contended that the very design of the government, with its divided powers and multiple branches, would serve as a bulwark against tyranny. Their logic was that by limiting what the government could do, by establishing checks and balances, there would be no need to spell out every right the people retained. Anti-Federalists, however, remained unconvinced. For them, the absence of explicit protections was a glaring weakness, a flaw that left the door open to future abuses. They pressed their case relentlessly, insisting that the very freedoms fought for in the Revolution could be swept away without clear safeguards. In several states, ratification was secured only after Federalist leaders promised to address these concerns through amendments. The demand for a Bill of Rights became a groundswell. State ratifying conventions did not quietly dissolve after their work was done. Instead, they drew up lists of recommended amendments, sending a clear message to the new government. Among those urging action was Thomas Jefferson, who, though away in France during the drafting, called the omission of a Bill of Rights one of the Constitution's chief defects. The pressure was now squarely on Congress to make good on the assurances given during the heated months of ratification. Into this charged atmosphere stepped James Madison, a figure whose thinking on the question of rights had evolved. Initially, Madison had sided with those who doubted the necessity of a Bill of Rights, reasoning that the Constitution's design already limited government powers. But as the political reality set in, and as the new government's legitimacy came to rest on its willingness to respond to public concerns, Madison recognized both the principle and the political wisdom of proposing amendments. His leadership was crucial. He took it upon himself to sift through the proposals sent in from the states, many of which echoed earlier documents like the Virginia Declaration of Rights and English legal precedents. Madison worked to craft amendments that would both satisfy the widespread demand for explicit protections and carefully avoid undermining the new government's authority. In the summer of 1789, during the very first session of Congress, Madison introduced a series of amendments. The debates that followed were spirited, but this time, the momentum was unstoppable. Lawmakers recognized that the legitimacy of the Constitution and perhaps the unity of the fledgling nation depended on enshrining certain rights beyond the reach of government. After months of deliberation, Congress sent 12 proposed amendments to the states for ratification. The process was not immediate. Ratification required the approval of 3/4 of the states, and the issue remained politically charged. Nevertheless, on December 15, 1791, 10 of Madison's proposed amendments were ratified, becoming what Americans now know as the Bill of Rights. This moment was more than a legal milestone, it was a political act of reassurance. The Bill of Rights spelled out in unmistakable language the freedoms the government could not infringe, the right to speak and worship freely, to assemble and petition, to be secure against unreasonable searches, to receive due process of law. These first 10 amendments drew clear boundaries around federal power, insisting that certain liberties belonged to the people, not the government. It would be easy, with the benefit of hindsight, to assume the Bill of Rights was inevitable or universally celebrated. In truth, its adoption reflected both principled debate and pragmatic compromise. Some Federalists remained wary, fearing that listing specific rights might imply that unlisted rights were unprotected. Others saw the amendments as necessary only to silence opposition. Yet, the Bill of Rights soon became central to the American identity, a touchstone for debates about freedom and government power. The story of the Bill of Rights did not end in 1791. From the beginning, the Constitution included a mechanism for amendment, a recognition that the work of self-government would never be truly finished. Over the years, this adaptability became one of the Constitution's defining features. Since 1791, the Constitution has been amended 27 times, each amendment a response to the shifting needs and values of American society. Some, like the 14th Amendment, dramatically expanded the scope of individual rights, ensuring equal protection and due process for all citizens, changes that reflected the nation's evolving understanding of liberty and justice. The Bill of Rights was born from fear as much as from hope. Fear of a too powerful government, fear that the hard-won freedoms of the Revolution might slip away. But it was also an act of hope, a statement of belief that a written guarantee could anchor the country's ideals and guide its future. The influence of these first 10 amendments has only grown over time. They have provided the language and the legal foundation for countless struggles for justice, from abolition and suffrage to the civil rights movement and beyond. They have shaped not only the laws of the land, but also the national consciousness, serving as a point of reference whenever Americans have asked what it means to be free. Yet, the meaning of the Constitution and its amendments has never been fixed. Even in the earliest years, Americans disagreed about how to interpret the rights and limits enshrined in the founding charter. Some have argued that the Constitution should be understood according to the public meaning it had at the time it was written, an approach known as originalism. Others have insisted that the Constitution is a living document, capable of evolving through interpretation and practice to meet the challenges of each new generation. This debate over interpretation has itself become part of the Constitution's legacy, a source of both tension and creativity, ensuring that the nation's founding document remains at the center of public life. Modern constitutional debates reflect this ongoing evolution. Courts, lawmakers, and citizens continue to wrestle with questions the framers could scarcely have imagined. What is the proper balance between security and privacy, between order and liberty? How should centuries-old language be applied to new technologies or shifting social realities? The answers are rarely simple, and the process of interpretation often leads to spirited disagreement. But the Constitution, with its carefully constructed mechanisms for amendment and its broad, sometimes ambiguous language, was designed to accommodate such debates. This capacity for change, for growth, is perhaps its most remarkable legacy. As the United States has grown and changed, the Constitution has endured, not as a relic, but as a living framework. The Bill of Rights, in particular, has proven both a shield and a rallying cry, invoked by Americans seeking to defend their freedoms or expand the promise of liberty to all. The process that gave birth to these amendments, rooted in conflict, compromise, and the persistent demand for justice, reminds us that democracy is not a finished product, but a continual act of creation. The Constitution's legacy, then, is not only in the text itself, but in the ongoing work of interpretation, amendment, and debate that has defined American government for more than 2 centuries. This work continues as each generation takes up the challenge of making the Constitution's promises real in their own time.